My name is Ren Hartley, and at 35, I learned that an inheritance has rules nobody ever writes down. And the first rule is this: the person who does the math is never the person who gets paid in it. At the dinner my parents threw to celebrate closing on my grandmother's house, my father walked me past the dining room, past the table set for 14, and pointed me toward a folding chair by the kitchen door. There just wasn't enough room at the family table, he said, already turning back toward the noise. Every aunt, every cousin, every in-law had a real seat with a cloth napkin, including the uncle who still owed my grandmother $18,000 he never paid back. I was the only one sitting under a hanging pot rack with a paper plate balanced on my knees. But here's what none of them knew. The metal tin I was holding in my lap, the one with my grandmother's handwriting still taped to the lid, wasn't the only thing she'd left behind. And in 6 weeks, what she'd actually left me would make the $840,000 they'd already spent look like a rounding error. If a story like this has ever been yours, you already know the feeling in your chest right now. Drop a comment and subscribe for more stories like it, because what happened over the next 6 weeks is the kind of thing that changes how you sit at every table for the rest of your life. I should tell you what I do before I tell you what happened, because the two are not separate. I'm a CPA. My specialty is trust and estate accounting, which is the unglamorous corner of the profession where you sit across from a grieving family and explain why the house they assumed was worth $1 million is actually going to net them $600,000 after repairs, commissions, and a lien nobody remembered signing. I built that career out of a state school accounting degree, a part-time bookkeeping job I worked through all 4 years, and a stubbornness nobody in my family ever had to develop, because nobody ever needed them to. My parents didn't pay for my school. My grandmother slipped me $200 in a card every Christmas and told me not to tell my mother. That was the entire scholarship fund. Everything else I built myself. The way you build a wall when nobody hands you bricks. You find them, one at a time wherever you can. That mattered later, because in my family, I was never the daughter anyone worried about. I was the daughter who handled things. If my grandmother's pharmacy switched her blood pressure medication without telling anyone, I caught it. If the insurance company denied a claim for her walker, I appealed it twice and won. If a holiday needed planning, or a doctor's note needed faxing, or a leaking roof needed 3 quotes instead of 1, I was already on it before anyone asked, because asking would have meant someone else was paying attention. And in my family, attention was a budget item nobody had ever allocated to me. My mother has a sentence she's said to me since I was 19 years old. You don't need it the way she does. She didn't mean money, not at first. She meant time, worry, attention. She meant, your sister is delicate and you are not, so I'm going to spend myself where it's needed. By the time I was 25, that sentence had quietly rewritten itself into a permanent assignment. I was the family's accountant, its scheduler, its emergency contact, its quiet infrastructure. Nobody signed me up for it. Nobody had to. I was good at it, and being good at something in my family was the same thing as being volunteered for it forever. Let me walk you through a Tuesday from 14 months ago, back when my grandmother was still in her own house on Larkspur Lane. 7:10 a.m., I call the pharmacy to confirm her blood pressure refill went through, because the automated system fails about once a month and nobody else checks. 7:40, I text my sister, Sophie, to remind her she promised to take Grandma to her cardiology follow-up on Thursday. She doesn't reply until Wednesday night, and the appointment is rescheduled to me, the way it always is. 9 o'clock, I call the home health agency to add 4 more hours a week, because Grandma's started forgetting whether she's eaten. 11:30, my mother calls. She doesn't say hello. She says, "Did you call about the roof?" I tell her I already have 2 quotes and I'm waiting on a 3rd. "Good," she says. Then, "Oh, and your father wants to know if the gutter guy can look at the garage door too while he's there." I add it to the list. By 4 p.m., I've coordinated a pharmacy, a cardiologist, a home health agency, and a contractor, and reminded a 31-year-old woman about an appointment for the grandmother who raised both of us in the same house. None of it was in any job description. All of it was simply assumed, the way water is assumed to run downhill. My family ran on me, and I ran on the quiet certainty that if I ever stopped, the whole structure would buckle. I was about to find out exactly how true that was, and exactly how little anyone valued the person holding it up. My father, Walter Hartley, is 64, and he has never walked into a room without counting who's watching him in it. Not because he's insecure, because he's calculating. Walter served 2 terms on the Rotary Club board and reminds people of it more often than the Rotary Club itself does. He gave a 17-minute toast at his own 40th wedding anniversary that somehow turned into a campaign speech for a town council seat he wasn't running for. He doesn't fear a microphone. He fears an empty chair, which is funny, considering what he did to mine. My mother, Carol, grew up the second of 4 daughters in a house where the grocery budget got recalculated weekly, and she carried that arithmetic into everything else. In her math, attention is a finite resource, and you spend it where the return looks highest. My sister Sophie was the return. Warm, easy to love, the kind of charming that doesn't require effort, just proximity. I was the infrastructure. Nobody throws a party for infrastructure. You just expect it to hold quietly in the background forever. Then there's Sophie herself, 29, recently engaged to a man named Marcus, the kind of person who has never paid a vendor invoice, never sat in a hospital waiting room past visiting hours, never once driven our grandmother to a single appointment because she never had to. She showed up, she smiled, and the best plate found its way to her automatically. The system worked for her, so she never thought to ask why it worked differently for me. And finally, my Uncle Roy, my father's younger brother, 58, between jobs more often than between paychecks, and the proud borrower of $18,000 from my grandmother in 2017 for a transmission shop that closed within a year. He never repaid a cent of it. My grandmother forgave the debt out loud at a Christmas dinner because, in her words, blood doesn't send invoices. Roy sat at that same table every year afterward, 3 seats from the woman whose retirement savings he'd quietly dented, asking for seconds on her cornbread. Nobody blinked. That was the architecture of my family. Walter needed an audience. Carol allocated attention by return on investment. Sophie collected the dividends. Roy got forgiven. I got the spreadsheet. My grandmother, Eleanor Hartley, everyone called her Nell, lived in the same house on Larkspur Lane for 51 years. It was a modest 3-bedroom with a wraparound screen porch and a lilac bush my grandfather planted the year my mother was born. Every holiday worth remembering happened on that porch. 4th of July, sparklers in the driveway. Thanksgiving with the windows steamed up from too many people and not enough ventilation. Easter egg hunts in a backyard barely big enough for a swing set, where Sophie and I, ages 6 and 8, once found the same plastic egg at the same time and split the candy inside right down the middle. The only even split I can remember between us. Nell had a stroke 6 years ago, mild enough that she recovered most of her speech and all of her stubbornness. But it scared the family enough that I was named her financial power of attorney the following spring. Not my father, even though he was older, and male, and the obvious choice in his own mind. Nell chose me, quietly, in a lawyer's office in Staunton and told nobody why. I didn't ask. I just started managing her accounts, her bills, her Medicare paperwork, the whole invisible architecture of an aging woman's independence. 14 months ago, she fell in her bathroom and broke a hip, and the house on Larkspur Lane became too much to manage alone. She moved into Brookhaven Senior Living, room Stochiternitsit, with a window that looked out on a courtyard she said reminded her of nothing in particular, which from Nell was as close as she ever got to complaining. She passed away 8 months ago, on a Tuesday morning, with me holding one hand and a hospice nurse checking a monitor that had already gone quiet. My father arrived 40 minutes later. My mother arrived an hour after that. Sophie was at a dress fitting for a wedding that hadn't even been planned yet, and found out over a text I sent because nobody else thought to. My father was named executor of Nell's estate because, in his words, I'm the son, as if that were a credential instead of a coincidence of biology. What being executor actually meant in practice was that I did the work, and he signed the documents I prepared, usually without reading them first. The house on Larkspur Lane needed work before it could sell for what it was worth. A 22-year-old roof, a kitchen that hadn't been touched since 1994, a water heater on its second decade of borrowed time. I got 3 contractor quotes for the roof and negotiated the winning one down by $4,000 by pointing out a measurement error in their estimate, the kind of detail you only catch if you read documents for a living. I coordinated the kitchen refresh, new counters, fresh paint, nothing extravagant, just enough to stop buyers from mentally subtracting $30,000 the second they walked in. I hired the stager. I scheduled 11 showings around my own client meetings. I fielded every offer, every counter, every inspection contingency, while my father told his Rotary friends he was handling his mother's estate, and my mother told her book club the same thing, in almost the same words. The house sold for $840,000, $60,000 over asking. After a bidding war I orchestrated by structuring the offer deadline on a Thursday afternoon, which a broker friend had told me years ago is when serious buyers panic. After repairs, commissions, and closing costs, the estate netted just under $790,000. I know that number exactly because I built the closing statement spreadsheet myself, the same way I'd built every other spreadsheet that had kept this family from falling through its own floor. Nobody asked me how I felt watching that house close. The house where I'd learned to ride a bike in the driveway and shelled peas on the porch with a woman who never once made me feel like infrastructure. Nobody asked, because asking would have meant someone else was paying attention, and that line had never once moved in 35 years. The decision about where that money would go happened without me in the room. I found out about it the way I found out about most things in my family. Secondhand, after the fact, dressed up as a celebration. It was my mother who called. 3 weeks after closing, her voice doing the bright, brisk thing it does when she's already announced something and wants it treated as settled rather than discussed. "We're having everyone over Saturday," she said, "to celebrate Grandma's house and to celebrate Sophie Marcus, Sophie's fiancé. We found the house, the one with the wraparound porch she's wanted since she was 12. We're closing on it next month." I asked carefully where the down payment was coming from. There was a pause, the kind that tells you the answer before the words do. "Your father and I talked about it," she said. "Sophie needs this. She's starting a family. You don't need it the way she does. You're already so settled." I sat at my kitchen table with the closing statement spreadsheet still open on my laptop screen, the one with $790,000 in it, and listened to my mother explain, in the gentlest voice she owns, that all of it, every single dollar, was already wired into an escrow account with my sister's name on it. Not split, not partial, all of it. "Of course you're invited Saturday," she added, as if that settled something. I want to tell you what I brought to that dinner because it matters for what happened later. When we cleared out the house on Larkspur Lane, I'd found a metal recipe tin in the back of Nell's pantry, the kind with a hinged lid and a faded rooster painted on the front. Inside were 40 years of recipe cards in her handwriting: cornbread, chess pie, the green bean casserole she made every Thanksgiving with bacon fat instead of butter, because she said butter was for people who hadn't lived through real hard times. Taped inside the lid, in handwriting that had gotten shakier over the years but never less certain, was a note: "For whoever keeps the kitchen going. Love, Mom." I'd decided the week before the dinner that I would give it to the whole family, photocopy the recipes, let everyone keep a piece of her. I spent 4 evenings scanning and printing 41 recipe cards into a bound booklet, one for each person on the guest list, plus the original tin, which I planned to give to my mother, since she was Nell's daughter, and it felt like it belonged with her. I drove to my parents' house Saturday afternoon with the tin on the passenger seat and the booklets in a tote bag, feeling something I hadn't earned yet and didn't fully trust. Something close to hope. The kind that sits on top of years of evidence and still somehow manages to float. The dining room table was set for 14, white tablecloth, the good china that comes out twice a year, a centerpiece of white roses Sophie had picked herself. I counted the place cards as I came in. Walter, Carol, Sophie, Marcus, Marcus's parents, my Aunt Deborah, my Uncle Roy, 3 of Sophie's bridesmaids, my cousin Hannah. 14 names, written in my mother's careful cursive. Mine wasn't one of them. I stood in the doorway holding the tin and the tote bag while my father came around the corner, saw me, and did the thing he does when something is inconvenient, which is to make it sound like logistics. "Oh, good, you're here," he said. "We're a chair short. There just wasn't enough room at the family table with Marcus's side here. You don't mind, do you?" He didn't wait for an answer. He walked me through the kitchen, past the swinging door to a folding chair set up beside a beige plastic step stool that someone had apparently decided would double as a side table. There was a paper plate already folded in half on it, and a roll of paper towels instead of cloth napkins. Through the doorway, I could see the dining room, candlelight, the good china, my mother's laugh carrying over the clink of glasses. I sat down. The metal tin sat on my lap because there was nowhere else to put it. From that angle, I could see almost the whole table. I could see my Aunt Deborah refilling her wine. I could see Uncle Roy reaching for a second helping of the rolls I'd dropped off that morning, because my mother had asked me to pick them up from the bakery on my way over. The same bakery, the same order every single year. I could see Sophie, glowing, leaning into Marcus's shoulder while my father stood and raised his glass. "To Sophie and Marcus," he said, his voice doing the thing it does at Rotary dinners, big enough to fill a room it didn't need to fill. and to the house that's going to start their whole future. Mom would be so proud to know her home is becoming someone else's home. Glasses clinked. My mother wiped her eyes with practiced precision. Nobody mentioned the word inheritance. Nobody mentioned the spreadsheet I'd built, or the 11 showings I'd scheduled, or the $4,000 I'd saved them on the roof. I sat on a folding chair in the kitchen, listening to a toast for a gift I had personally generated, with a paper plate on my knees and a tin of my grandmother's recipes in my lap, and I counted. 14 minutes. In 14 minutes, exactly 0 people came to check on me. Not one. I want to be clear about what happened next, because people always expect an explosion. They expect the thrown plate, the shouted speech, the dramatic exit through a dining room full of witnesses. That's not what happened. What happened was arithmetic. I sat on that folding chair and did the math. 6 years as Nell's financial power of attorney, 14 months coordinating her move into Brookhaven, 11 showings on a house I'd repaired, staged, and sold $60,000 over asking. $790,000 that had gone in full to a sister who had never once driven to a single doctor's appointment for the woman whose house it was. The numbers didn't add up to rage. They added up to clarity. I hadn't been forgotten. I'd never been counted in the first place. I had mistaken being useful for being valued, and that confusion had already cost me 6 years of Tuesdays I would never get back. The chair pinched against the back of my knees. I looked down at the tin in my lap. 41 recipe cards in a dead woman's handwriting, a note taped inside that said, "For whoever keeps the kitchen going." And I understood with a kind of cold, settled certainty that I had made something thoughtful for people who'd put me by the trash can. And the worst part wasn't the chair. The worst part was that they expected me to stay there quietly, hear the toast through a swinging door, and show up afterward to help load the dishwasher, because I always did. Because I had never once stopped. That was when the arithmetic became a decision. Not a loud one. The quiet kind. The kind that sounds like a key turning in a lock you didn't know you owned. I stood up. The folding chair scraped against the kitchen tile, and the sound cut through the dining room like a period at the end of a very long sentence. I picked up the tin, left the tote bag of booklets on the counter, and walked through the swinging door into the dining room. I didn't run. I didn't raise my voice. I walked the way I walk into a closing meeting, level shoulders, even pace, eyes forward. My mother saw me first. She always notices movement before she notices people. My father looked up mid-sentence. Sophie paused with her fork halfway to her mouth. I walked past the head of the table, past the white roses, past Uncle Roy reaching for a third roll, and toward the front door. My mother's chair scraped behind me. I heard her heels on the hardwood. Ren, wait. Don't do this in front of everyone. I reached the door, turned, and looked at her. She was 3 steps behind me, her face arranged in the expression she wears when someone is about to make her look bad in front of people whose opinion she's curated for decades. "You don't need it the way she does," she said, like a password, like the sentence that had always sent me quietly back to my seat. I held up the tin so she could see it clearly. "You said there wasn't room at the family table," I said. "There's room now." I turned and walked to my car. She did not follow. That night I sat on my couch with a glass of water and my phone face down on the cushion. I didn't want to look at it. I looked anyway. The Hartley family group chat had 31 new messages, mostly photos of the roses and a blurry video of my father's toast. I scrolled past the surface noise and found a side thread underneath, one I'd missed because my phone files family logistics into a folder I check once a week. It started 4 days earlier. My mother. Seating for Saturday. We're a chair short with Marcus's parents added. Ren can sit in the kitchen, she won't make a thing of it. My father. Good call. More room for people who will actually appreciate the toast. Sophie. LOL, she's basically used to it at this point, she'll understand. Nobody else responded, which meant nobody else objected. The thread continued for 6 more messages, logistics about paper plates, whether to mention it to me in advance. No, my mother wrote. She'll make it weird if we tell her ahead of time. I read it twice. I didn't screenshot it. I didn't need evidence. I wasn't building a case. I was finally reading a fact that had been true for years and simply hadn't been written down where I could see it before. My family had never considered me a guest at my own grandmother's farewell. They'd put it in writing, casually, sloppily, because they never imagined I'd be looking. I put the phone down and finished my water. The next morning I made coffee, sat at my kitchen table and opened a new spreadsheet. Old habits, column headers, task, frequency, hours, value, status. I listed everything. 6 years of power of attorney duties, every bill, every Medicare appeal, every pharmacy call. 14 months coordinating Brookhaven, every move-in form, every care plan review. 11 showings, 3 contractor negotiations, 1 closing statement built from scratch. The family calendar I'd kept since I was 24. Sophie's car registration, which I'd renewed twice because she forgot the notices came by mail. My father's quarterly estimated tax payments, which I'd calculated every April for 9 years because he genuinely did not understand the concept of a 1099. 38 recurring items. 38 tasks, none of them assigned, acknowledged, or compensated, adding up by a conservative hourly estimate built from my own billing rate to just under $91,000 of unpaid professional labor over 6 years, not counting the part of me that can't be billed by the hour at all. I looked at that number the way I look at a client's balance sheet when they insist everything reconciles, and the numbers say otherwise. The numbers always say otherwise. I wasn't going to send a manifesto. I wasn't going to post anything or explain anything to anyone who hadn't asked. I was going to do something simpler and much more devastating. I was going to stop. Monday morning, I called Brookhaven and removed myself as the emergency contact and billing contact on file. I emailed the storage facility where Nell's remaining furniture sat in a 10x10 unit, $26 a month, autopay linked to my own card since the move, and switched the account to my father's name. I didn't announce any of it. I just changed the settings and stepped back. The first crack appeared 9 days later. The storage facility called my father about a declined payment, since he hadn't actually updated the card on file the way the email had asked him to. He had 30 days to fix it or the unit would go to lien sale. He called me, furious, certain I'd done something to his mother's belongings. I told him the email had his name on it and the deadline was in the email too. He said, "Need to handle this." I said, "No." I had said that word to clients before. I had never said it to my father about anything that wasn't billable. It felt like setting down a box I'd been carrying so long my arms didn't remember how to be empty. The second crack was bigger. The estate's final tax filing required an allocation of the stepped-up basis on the house, the kind of detail that determines whether the family owes capital gains tax on the appreciation or not. I'd been quietly preparing the documentation for months, the appraisal at date of death, the improvement records. Everything needed to show the full $790,000 had a stepped-up basis and wouldn't trigger a massive tax bill. I'd planned to file it myself, the way I'd filed everything else, for free, the way I always had. I didn't finish it. Nobody else in my family had ever filed an estate return in their life. By April, the IRS sent a notice based on the executor's incomplete filing, the one my father had signed without understanding, assuming a much lower basis than the truth. The estimated bill, before any correction, was $46,000. My father called me 11 times in 1 week. I let it go to voicemail 9 of those times. On the 10th, I told him the appraisal documents were in a folder on the shared drive he'd never opened, and that a competent estate attorney could fix it for a fraction of what the bill currently said. I didn't offer to be that attorney. I am not an attorney. I am, very specifically, the accountant who used to do this work for free. By week 3, the calls had changed tone. The first 2 weeks were logistical, panicked, full of questions only I had answers to. By week 3, they sounded entitled. My mother called on a Tuesday evening, her voice carrying the particular sharpness she uses when she's embarrassed but unwilling to say so. "Ren, why didn't you finish the estate paperwork? Your father's getting threatening letters from the IRS." I told her I wasn't the executor. My father was. She said, "You know he doesn't understand any of that." I said, "I know. I knew that 9 years ago, too." She hung up. My father's version came 2 days later, louder and less specific. "Your mother is a wreck. This family is falling apart over a chair. What exactly are you trying to prove?" I told him I wasn't trying to prove anything. I was simply done doing unpaid work for people who'd seated me by the trash can. "After everything we've done for you," he started, and then stopped, because he couldn't finish the sentence with anything specific. What had they done for me? He couldn't list it. There wasn't one. Stay with me, because this is the part where it gets quiet, and then it gets loud. If this is hitting close to home, subscribe so the algorithm sends it to someone who needs to hear it tonight. Tell me in the comments if you've ever heard the words "after everything we did for you" used as a closing argument with absolutely nothing behind it. because I had read versions of that sentence in other people's stories for years and never once believed I'd be the one writing it. I drove out to see my great-aunt Vivian on a Sunday, Nell's younger sister, 82, sharp as the day she retired from teaching high school chemistry. She still lives alone in a house 20 minutes from Brookhaven, with a garden she refuses to let anyone else weed. She made tea and listened to the whole thing without interrupting, which is something Vivian has always been good at. When I finished, she set down her cup and said, "Your mother was the same way once, you know." I looked at her. "When Carol was young, your grandmother and I were raising 4 girls on one teacher's salary between us. And Carol was the one who did everything for her younger sisters. Cooking, homework, getting them dressed for school when I was at work. Your grandmother used to call her my little secretary." Carol hated it. She swore she'd never let her own daughter feel that way. Vivian paused. "Then she had you. And you were so good at it. I think she forgot what it felt like to be the one doing the carrying instead of the one being carried." It was the closest anyone had ever come to explaining my mother to me. Not excusing her. Explaining her. Carol had been the backup chair once, too. She'd escaped it by handing the chair to me. That didn't undo the kitchen, or the group chat, or 6 years of unpaid power of attorney work. But it made her human. And I needed her to be human, because the alternative that she had simply decided I mattered less on purpose was a door I wasn't ready to open all the way. Vivian reached over and squeezed my hand. "You keep that tin somewhere safe," she said. Nell knew exactly what she was doing when she wrote that note. I didn't understand yet how true that sentence was. I would, in 5 weeks. Something else happened in those weeks, something smaller. But it mattered. I went on a date with a man named Owen, a structural engineer a colleague introduced me to, and for the first time in years, nobody asked me to organize anything, not even the restaurant. He picked the place, made the reservation, and pulled out my chair without thinking twice about it, the way you do for someone, not the way you do for a coordinator. I almost cried into the breadbasket. I repainted my own kitchen the color Nell always wanted hers to be. A soft sage green my mother had vetoed decades ago for being too much. I took on 2 new estate clients. I started sleeping through the night again. 6 years of being everyone's infrastructure had taught me to mistake exhaustion for purpose, and for the first time, I was learning the difference. It started with a conversation at my friend Priya's kitchen table over wine and crackers. Priya is a marriage and family therapist with a practice in Charlottesville, and she'd been listening to my story unfold in real time for months. "You know there are thousands of people like you," she said. She meant it clinically, but I heard it personally. People who run their family's finances and logistics without credit, who are the first call in a crisis and the last name on any guest list, who mistake being indispensable for being valued, and only learn the difference once it's far too late to get the years back. I asked if she'd ever considered a support group for people like that. She looked at me over her glass and said, "I've been waiting for someone to ask." We held the first meeting on a Wednesday evening in the back room of a coffee shop. 6 people, 3 of them daughters who'd managed a parent's finances, 1 a sister, 1 a nephew, 1 a woman who had handled her brother's entire divorce paperwork and hadn't been invited to his second wedding. We called it the ledger, because every one of us had spent years entering hours into a family's books that never once got reconciled. The first woman who spoke, Maritza, 53, a paralegal from Waynesboro, said something I haven't forgotten. "You mean I'm allowed to just stop?" She asked it like she was requesting permission to breathe. By the time spring came, we had 17 members and a waiting list, meeting every other week. Mostly listening, sometimes crying, occasionally laughing at the specific, absurd cruelty of a family that thanks you by forgetting you exist. The letter arrived on a Thursday in May, 6 weeks after the dinner, on letterhead from a law office in Staunton I didn't recognize. Pruitt and Combs, attorneys at law. Inside was a short note from an attorney named Thomas Pruitt, asking me to call his office at my convenience regarding a matter related to the estate of Eleanor Hartley, to be disclosed 90 days following the closing of the primary estate per the client's written instruction. I called that afternoon. Pruitt's voice was the kind that spent 40 years delivering both good news and bad news in exactly the same calm register. "Your grandmother came to see me 7 years ago," he said, about 2 months after her stroke. "She didn't want this discussed with anyone until the house on Larkspur Lane had fully closed and the dust had settled, however long that took." Those were her words. However long that took. He explained that Nell had inherited a small commercial property from her own mother decades earlier, a duplex on Coulter Street that she'd quietly kept titled in her own name never mentioned at a single family dinner, and rented out to the same two tenants for over 20 years. She'd also built a modest brokerage account over the same period, funded by the rental income and a portion of my grandfather's life insurance she'd never touched. 7 years ago, she'd placed both assets into an irrevocable trust, naming me as sole beneficiary, structured specifically so that neither asset would ever pass through her will or her probate estate, which meant neither one had anything to do with the house, the $790,000, or any decision my parents had ever made about where that money would go. Your grandmother told me something I've never forgotten, Pruitt said. She said, they will tell her she doesn't need it the way her sister does. They are wrong. She has always needed someone to actually see her. So I'm going to see her, where they can't undo it. The duplex on Coulter Street was appraised at $261,000, fully paid off, generating just over $2,100 a month in rent. The brokerage account held $147,000, combined $408,000, already legally mine, already outside of anyone's reach, since before my grandmother's stroke had even been confirmed, since before a single family meeting had ever been held about a single dollar of that house. It hadn't been a question of fighting for a share. There was nothing to fight for, because it had never belonged to them at all. 3 days later, my father called and asked, stiffly, if I would come to a family meeting about the IRS situation. Sophie's closing had also hit a snag. The title company needed a copy of the estate distribution letter to confirm the down payment funds were legitimate gift funds and not a loan, and nobody but me had ever actually generated that letter. I agreed to come. Not for my father, not for my mother, for the version of this family that still, somewhere, contained Vivian's tea and Nell's cornbread and a swing set in a backyard barely big enough for 2 girls splitting a plastic egg. I spent 2 days preparing. Not a gift this time. A folder. Plain, manila, with the 38-item spreadsheet, the closing statement from the house, the IRS notice my father had forwarded, and the appraisal showing the stepped-up basis that would fix the whole $46,000 problem in about an afternoon. Underneath all of it, in a separate envelope, the letter from Pruitt's office. I drove past my parents' house the morning before the meeting and let myself into their garage, where the folding chair from the dinner had been leaning against the wall since the night I'd left it there. I asked my mother's permission through a text, which she answered with a single confused question mark, and took it anyway. I set it in the back of my car next to the recipe tin, which Vivian had insisted I bring back. So Nell's at the table this time, one way or another. The dining room table was reset for the meeting, the good china put away, replaced with legal pads and a box of tissues Sophie had clearly bought on the way over, just in case. I walked in carrying the folder, the tin, and the folding chair, and set the chair up at the end of the table in clear view of everyone, the same beige plastic, the same scuffed legs. I didn't sit in it. I sat in a real chair beside it and let it lean there, impossible to ignore. My father started talking about the IRS notice before I'd even taken my coat off, the patriarch voice. The one that sounds like a request and lands like an order. We need you to fix this, Ren. You understand the tax stuff. We don't. I opened the folder and turned it so the table could see. This is a list of everything I've done for this family, unpaid for 6 years, I said. Power of attorney duties for Grandma. The entire sale of the Larkspur Lane house. Your father's tax filings for 9 years. Sophie's car registration twice. 38 recurring items conservatively valued at $91,000. I turned the page. This is the appraisal that fixes the IRS notice. It's been sitting on the shared drive since February. Anyone could have opened it. My mother's face did the thing it does when she knows something is about to go wrong and hopes that smiling hard enough will stop it. I reached into the second envelope. And this is from Grandma's attorney. 7 years ago, she put the Coulter Street duplex and a brokerage account into an irrevocable trust. In my name. $408,000. It was never part of her will. It was never part of the house. It was never yours to decide where it went, because by the time you decided to give Sophie every dollar of that $790,000, this had already belonged to me for 7 years. The table went silent. My mother said very quietly, "That's family money, Ren. We should talk about sharing it fairly." I looked at her. "You said there wasn't room at the family table for me, at the dinner where you gave away everything Grandma left behind. There's room now. There's a seat with my name on it at my own table, and it's been there the whole time. You just never looked." My father said I was being dramatic, that I was tearing the family apart over a chair and some paperwork. "You didn't build this family," I said. I ran it. There's a difference, and you've never once had to learn it because I never let you feel the gap. Sophie, who had been quiet the whole time, finally spoke. This is kind of insane, Ren. We didn't know about any of this. I know, I said. That's exactly the point. Grandma made sure you couldn't. Across the table, my Aunt Deborah, who'd been quiet through all of it, turned to her husband. While we're on the subject of money nobody talks about, Roy, did you ever pay Mom back that $18,000? The table cracked open. Not into chaos, into honesty. 6 conversations happening at once. None of them about me anymore. I stood up, not in anger, not in triumph. In the same level, measured way I'd walked out of the kitchen 6 weeks earlier. I left the folding chair where it stood. I didn't need it anymore. I have my own chairs now. I'm not cutting anyone off, I said to the table. I'm not disappearing. I'm just going home to my own table. If you want a relationship with me going forward, it starts with my name being said out loud, not just dialed when something breaks. Nobody answered. I picked up the tin and walked out to my car. I drove straight to Vivian's, the long way, with the windows down even though it was barely warm enough. She opened the door before I knocked, like she'd been expecting exactly this. I told her everything. The folder, the duplex, the brokerage account, the look on my mother's face. She listened without interrupting, the way she always does. And when I finished, she said, well, Nell always did love a good long con, as long as it was for the right reasons. We made cornbread that night, her recipe and Nell's recipe, which turned out to be the same recipe, just written down twice by 2 sisters who'd learned it from the same mother. The fallout was measurable. The IRS bill, once a competent estate attorney filed the corrected basis documentation I'd left on the shared drive, dropped from $46,000 to just under $3,000 in penalties for the late filing, which my father paid himself. The first estate-related bill he'd ever personally handled in his life. Sophie's closing delayed 2.5 weeks while the title company sorted out the gift fund documentation without me, and her interest rate lock expired in the process, costing her an extra $11,000 over the life of the loan, a number she will be paying, slowly, for 30 years. Uncle Roy's $18,000 question didn't get answered at the table, but it didn't disappear either. Aunt Deborah brought it up again at Easter, and again at the 4th of July, until Roy finally started sending $50 a month, a debt that, at that rate, will be paid off around the time he turns 91. The storage unit got sorted out eventually by my father, who discovered in the process that he genuinely did not know which box held his own mother's photo albums, because he had never once opened one. My mother stopped saying, "You don't need it the way she does." She replaced it for a while with silence, and then, slowly, with something that occasionally resembled an actual question about my life instead of a request for a task. I used part of the trust to put a down payment on a house of my own, a smaller one than Sophie's, with a kitchen I actually cook in and a dining table that seats 8, every single chair purchased on purpose, not inherited, not borrowed, not folding. The duplex on Coulter Street still rents to the same 2 tenants, $2,100 a month, deposited automatically, a quiet, steady proof that someone once looked at me clearly enough to plan for a future I hadn't even started believing I deserved. The ledger meets every other Wednesday now, 23 members and counting in a real room with real chairs, every single one of them occupied on purpose. Vivian comes to my house most Sundays. We make cornbread from the recipe in the tin, the one with the note taped inside the lid, and she tells me stories about Nell that get a little better, a little more specific every time she tells them. I host Thanksgiving now. I invited my parents this year. They came. My father didn't give a toast. My mother brought the same rolls from the same bakery, and for the first time in 6 years, she'd picked them up herself. A chair you have to fight for every single time was never really yours to begin with. The people who actually see you don't put conditions on your seat. Sometimes they build you a different table altogether, quietly, years in advance, and trust that you'll find your way to it eventually, even if it takes a folding chair in a kitchen to make you start looking. That's my story. 6 years of invisible work, 1 folding chair, and a tin of recipes that turned out to be worth more than $840,000 because it came with the one thing the money never did. If you've ever been the family's accountant without a paycheck, the one who holds everything together and gets seated last, take this as your sign. You're allowed to sit down. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today.